Hello, my name is Michael Balchitis, and welcome to my course, Learning Adobe Photoshop for Designers. What we're going to be doing in this course is we're going to first go through the interface and understanding how to move around an image. Next, we're going to go into the selecting tools, and we'll learn how to select an image. Next, we'll go into working with layers and understanding the hierarchy of the layer palette. Next, we'll move on to type and its effects, and we'll be learning typography. Next, we'll be going into paint and the pen tool, which is very useful. Next, we'll go into layer masks and shape layers. After that, we'll move on to smart objects and filters. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with being able to save for print and for the web. Okay, so in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to learn a little bit about the interface. Now I have this little creature that I created. I actually made this in Cinema 4D. I do have some Cinema 4D courses available as well, so you might want to check those out. But what we want to do is we want to take a look at a little bit about the interface and moving around this image. So you can see that we have our menu up at the top of our screen, and we have our tools on the left-hand side, and we have some more tools over here on the right-hand side and our layer palette. Now, the first thing I want to show you, and it's something that is very useful, especially when you're first starting and working out in Adobe Photoshop. What you're going to be doing is a lot of times, a lot of this information becomes a little overwhelming, and sometimes you just don't want to see it. You just want to focus on the work that you're using. So what we can do is we can go to our view and we can go into screen mode. We have our standard screen mode, full screen mode with menu bar, and then full screen mode. So if I go to, right now we're in standard screen mode, which is just, we have all the available information, all the available tools and palettes available to us. So if I go to screen mode and then go to full screen mode with menu bar, you can see that this kind of shuts things down a little bit easier, so it's a little bit more compact, and you can have a little bit more real estate in which to work with within your screen. Now we can go this even further if we go to view, screen mode, and then we can go to full screen mode, and now we have this in full with no palettes, no menus or anything. The only thing we do have here is our ruler, and we can even turn that off using Command R, and that takes away our ruler. So now you can see that now we just have our image within our screen. And this is important because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be working with guides, you're going to be working with all kinds of tools, you're going to have different palettes open, and a lot of times it just becomes very cluttered. So it's a good idea, so when you're working and you're working on an object, to go into full screen mode, and this just gives you just the look of your design or whatever you're working on. And I kind of look at it as similar to when you're drawing and you want to take a step back away from the easel and just look at your work far away and being able to see the whole picture. Because, you know, a lot of times you're working on very detailed, you're zoomed in, and you're kind of just working on like a part here, and you're not seeing the whole thing as a whole. So it's just something to keep in mind when working within Photoshop. So speaking of zoom, we can have a few different options with our zoom. You can see right now that our percentage down here is about 82%. Now we can go to our magnifying glass, and we can kind of zoom in to our object just by clicking. And you can see as I click, this percentage down here at the bottom changes 200. And if we hold down our Option key on our keyboard, you can see now that our magnifying glass goes from a plus sign to a minus sign, and we can then zoom out. And we also have a few other options. We can also go to our Command minus on our keyboard, and that will zoom out, and then Command plus on our keyboard, and that zooms in incrementally. And you can notice that within our little percentage thing here down at the bottom. Now, there's also a keyboard shortcut. A lot of times you'll just be working, you'll be zooming in, but you want to quickly move to your 100% magnification. So you can go to Command 1, and that will go to 100%. And you also have Command 0, which allows it to fit within your screen. So in this case, this is a pretty large image. So when I go to Command 0, it goes to, about roughly 80%. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, great. So next, what we want to do is we want to start looking around how to move an image within this, within our interface. So a lot of times you'll be needing to move something around. Say for an example, you have this zoomed in pretty good, and you're working on an area, say a shoulder, and you're doing some color correction, or you're adding in some effects or something like that. You want to then move over to his other shoulder and do the same thing. You can use this hand tool, and that's H on your keyboard. Oh, by the way, if you hover over any of the tools, you can see the name of the tool, but next to it you can see that has H next to hand tool. That gives you an idea of what keyboard key will be used to go to that tool. So if say I'm on the move tool, which is V, and then I can just press H, now I'm on the hand tool. So what you can then do is move this image within your interface, within Photoshop. But you can also say an even easier way, say if you're selecting or if you're working on another tool, instead of toggling between these tools using the keyboard command, an even faster way is just holding down the space bar, and then you can just move around and then do whatever you need to do with the tool that you're using that you currently have. So you don't have to change a tool. And you can see that by your cursor changing just when you press the space bar, it goes to the hand tool, and then you can move your image around. And also you do have these sliders down here on the side and on the bottom to move around as well. I rarely use these. I usually use the hand tool, or if I want to just click on the hand tool and then be able to just move it around freely. Okay, so Command 1, we'll get back to 100%. I'll go to fit the screen, so Command 0. So now we have our image set up. So in the next lesson, what we want to do is we want to start looking at some of the tools and what a lot of these interfaces mean. We're just going to go over just kind of an overview of everything. And this lesson will be more of a quick start. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at each individual tools, and we'll just know which one they are, and we'll get to those in more depth as the course moves on. Okay, let's take a look at the interface a little bit. I'm not going to go into very specific into each of the tools. I just want you to know where they are and where things are located within Adobe Photoshop. Okay, so normally you'll see this in pretty much all software. You'll have a menu at the top. Now we'll have our Photoshop, and this is where we have our preferences. We'll have our file where we'll be able to open up new documents, create new documents, open up documents, and save out documents. We have our edit, image, and this is where we can adjust a little bit of our image size, and we have some of our adjustment layers here, and as well as our mode. Here we'll have our layers, and this will pretty much a whole menu is dedicated just to this layer palette over here. We have the same thing for type, since these are going to be the things that you're going to be using pretty much all the time within Photoshop. You're going to be using the image, layer, type, and select, and maybe some filters, depending on what you're trying to do. This is a little bit more focused on design, but you are going to be using some filters that I use often and most designers will use often. And then 3D, which isn't really applicable to this course. And then you have our view, which we went over a little bit briefly in our quick start. But we'll have everything that will be set up in here as well. You'll be using Snap as well and a lot of the show. So you'll see like maybe hide your grid or layer slices, pixel grids, stuff like that. And then we'll have our window. And now window is going to be all the little palettes that you might use that is a little bit more specific to a particular tool or a particular function within Adobe Photoshop. And, you know, we'll go into these a little bit more. Some of them are useful. Some of them just, you know, you kind of use them once in a while sparingly, but you don't use them all the time. So there's no need to have all of these open. Now, and then we have our help system within Adobe. Now over here on the side, you're going to have tools that you're going to be using quite often, such as your brush. You're going to be using your brush pretty much all the time. If you're going to be painting something out, or if you're going to be masking something, brushes are going to be something that you'll be using a lot. And you also have the brush over here as well. Now, next we'll be using clone. Clone is also something you use a lot. Now, this is, you know, if you're going to be doing designing for like the web or graphic design, there are going to be times where you're going to need to do something within like an image, such as this one here. You want to clone something out that you don't like, or a photograph. And then next we'll have our typography, or our type, excuse me. And then we'll have our character and paragraph palettes. That's the same thing here. If you just click on this one, this icon, it'll give you a paragraph. And then, you know, for alignment and leading and tracking and that type of thing. And then we'll also have our tool presets and then our libraries, which is also helpful, especially if you're using something, if you're doing like a whole set of, say, emails or banners or something like that, and you want to change this, you have like a logo that you want to keep in, you have certain colors that you want to use. It's also very, very useful. Okay, so next over here we have our palettes for, say, our layer. I also have open paths, which I use quite often. History palette, which is also very useful, and I'll kind of go over that a little bit. Channels, so we have our different RGB. If we want to just focus in on a specific color, we can do that as well. And then our properties, which gives you an idea of, you know, how big something is if you have a selection, and you can see how big that selection is. So I actually have this selected to fixed size. Just go back to normal. And so let me go over to our layers palette. And I'm going to go over, again, I'm going to go over this very specifically, but this is something that you're probably going to have open almost all the time. And we'll go through this, every little section of this in greater detail. Now up here, you'll have some more important tools that you're going to be using. One of them is auto select. So right now I just have one layer, but if I add in another layer, and let me just quickly add in, let me choose a different color. And I'm just going to add in this color to this layer. Now, if I have an image, say this background image, and I'm just gonna remove that lock. So this image I can move around freely, and this graphic I can move around freely as well. But say I'm on this layer and I want to select this little block here, this orange square. So you can use the move tool to click and select this object. But you'll notice in my layer palette, it jumps to the selection of this image. The reason why that happens is because you have auto select checked. If I don't have auto select checked, and I click on this orange box with this image selected, and I click and drag, you can see I'm not moving this orange, even though I'm clicking on this square, this orange square, I'm just only moving this background image, the photograph. So that's something that you're going to be using. You're going to be toggling back and forth between this, often, because sometimes you might want to just move a whole folder, and I can do that here. If I click on this icon, I can get a folder, and I can just move this image, this cube, this this square into this folder. And I just want to move this group. Maybe I have a bunch of other different layers in here as well that I just want to move those layers. What you do, you want to just have this selected, this folder selected, and then you can move this and everything else within this folder around. So just keep that in mind as you're using these tools, and I'm going to go into layers a little bit more. So that's your move tool. You also have your selection tool. You also have various other tools here for selecting. You'll have your wand. You'll have slices, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. And you have all the tools that you're going to be needing to manipulate, adjust, or change objects within Photoshop, whether it be a something like a vector type, smart object. Like if I make this rectangle is a little bit different than this cube here, because what we can then do is select these points and then move these around to change our shape. You can't do that with this particular object. Let me go back to my layers. If I go to this object, I can't do that. So that's a little bit different. Then we have our pen tool, we have our type tool, we have individual selection we have our path, or we have direct selection, and then we went over our hand and our magnifying glass. So under here, we're going to have these two colors. We have our foreground color and we have our background color. And then we have these two icons here. So you notice that I filled in this color into this selection here, this square. But we also have our background. Now we can change this color. If I just click on this color, just simple click, and then you can change this color by using this color picker dialog box. And you can just move this around here and find the color that you want. Now you also have this slider that gives you a grade of different colors within this color library, and you can choose, either purple. You can choose all the spectrum of colors that you have here. And then we also have a lot of these coordinates that you can change depending if you're using HSB, RGB, CMYK. So we have different sections for that as well. Also, we have a hexadecimal coordinate number system here as well, and that's more for web. And so what you can then do is switch between these background and foreground colors. And say if I choose a different color here, and I had green, so let's try blue. And we can just switch these by using this icon here. And then if you want to go back to your default black and white, you can click on this icon here, and it goes back to its black and white default. And then we have our quick mask down here as well. So that just kind of gives you an overview of this interface, and it's definitely useful, and you're going to be using, this whole the whole interface as you're working. There isn't going to be a time where you're not going to be using any of these little sections. So it's an idea to get a good understanding of where these things are. So in the next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to start getting into selecting within our image. Okay, in this lesson, I'm going to talk about selecting within Photoshop. Okay, so we have a few selecting tools on the left-hand side here. Now we have the rectangle marquee tool, and you can press M on your keyboard to also bring up that tool. And then we also have, if you click and hold on this icon, you can see that we have a few different other options in which to choose in order to make selecting. In fact, anytime you see a little arrow at the bottom right-hand corner of an icon, you know that there's other options to choose from. So for move, you have artboard tool. For the tool right below it, the lasso tool, you have different type of tools for that. So just keep in mind that there are more tools nested within this icon. So anyway, if I use the rectangle marquee tool and I have that selected, now we have a few different options here at this this sort of like an attributes over here for each of our tools. So with the marquee tool, what you do is you click and drag while still holding down your mouse or stylus. You can see that you have this marquee that you drag around. Now you can also hold down your space bar and move the marquee around. It stays to that side, and keep in mind your mouse button is still held down. And then when you release, you release your mouse button. You can see that you have your marquee around an object that you want to move. So the same applies to your elliptical tool as well. So I'm going to deselect this, and you can go to select and then deselect, or you can also go to Command D on your keyboard to deselect. That's what I usually do. I go Command D to deselect. And you can then go to your elliptical marquee tool. Same situation, but if you click and drag while holding, you can see that you can make an elliptical shape with your elliptical tool. So same applies if you hold down your space bar. You now then can move that marquee anywhere you want. It stays to that size, but you can move it anywhere within your document. Okay, so now what you can also do, and let me go back to my rectangular marquee. If I click and drag and then hold down Shift, you can see it constrains to an exact square. So no matter where I move my mouse, as I hold the button down, you can see it keeps to that perfectly square marquee. And as well for your elliptical marquee tool, hold down Shift and it keeps it a perfect circle. Now we also have these other options here. We have single row marquee and single column marquee tool. So I'm going to go to single row, and if I just click, you can see I get a marquee that goes across the entire document in a horizontal selection. So I'm going to click again just so I can have it over one of these objects. And I'm going to zoom in, holding down Z. I can then zoom in by clicking and dragging to the right. We can zoom in to our document. And that zoom will zoom right into the spot where the cursor is. So you can see that we have this 1 pixel by the entire length of our object, of our document. So this is good in, say, in case, say I have this image or this layer selected and I want to delete, I can just delete 1 pixel row of that layer, whatever's on that layer. So I'm going to Command Z to undo, and then Command Z to undo again, and then deselect. So there are situations where you want to use your selection tool to say maybe cut out a piece of your object. So what I'm going to do is drag a marquee, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press either Command C, which is copy, or Command X, which is cut. So if I go to Command C, it's now this object, whatever is in this marquee, is now copied to my clipboard. So if I move this over to this area over here and I press Command V, now it's going to paste in that copy into a new layer. You can see as I close the visibility of this layer, you can see now that is on its new layer, but I still have the piece that I selected still part of this other object. And like I said, I have auto select on, so if I select this, you can see I can still move this around. So I can move this over to the side. Maybe I want to add in a little graphic here. There's other options to do that, but say you wanted to cut a piece off of another graphic or image to use within your layout here. You can do that. Now, if I used cut, I say I select this and want to make sure that I cut this. So I go to Command X, it's going to cut away from that image, but it's still going to be in my clipboard. So if I make another selection, paste, it's going to paste that in, but it's also going to cut out that one image. So it's just, however you want to work, but I just want to show you that that's something that you can also do as well. So that is the selecting of this using these tools. Now you also have a few other options right to the tool right below it. You have a lasso tool, which is the same situation. It's the same selecting as you did before, but it's drawn in freehand. So you get a selection, but if you click and drag, as you're holding down your mouse button, or in my case, I'm using a Wacom tablet, if you're holding down, you can see that now you have just that selection. So this is good if you have something very specific that you want to cut out, that a more angular selection from, like, say, the rectangle or elliptical you just can't get this around. So say you wanted to just select this little feathered edge from this graphic and make sure I'm on this image here. So I'm going to select this layer, and now I have this little tiny piece selected. So what I then can do is Command C and then Command 1 to bring this back out to full view. And now I can and then I can just select using my lasso tool and then paste within that selection. So I can do that as well. And then if I need to, I can transform, Command T to transform and get this particular graphic out, and then just simply move it around. So that's another way you can do that as well. Now, if you have, say, for an example, if you go to the Polygonal lasso tool, this is a particularly good use. And let me go to a new layer. I'm going to go to here, and this icon here, and that'll give me a new layer. And say I wanted to go to a selection, and I want to pull this out, holding down Shift, and then I'm going to go to my color picker, click on this on our foreground, and then I'm going to go to, say, this pink here. Click OK, and then I'm going to go to Option, Delete, and that's going to fill that selection with the foreground. So let me deselect. Let's say I wanted to have, a little angle here where I want to put in, say, for an example, something that will give me a little bit more information, sort of a dog ear graphic on the corner here. So this is where this Polygonal lasso tool is also very useful. So if I click and hold down Shift, you can see where I get this, freehand, but if I hold down Shift, it'll constrain to a 45-degree angle. So then what I can do then is go to click again, and then click again, and then click again. And now if I release the Shift, I can just connect this end to my beginning point. Now you know that because if you hover close to that beginning point, you can see a little O. It sort of closes off. It's an icon that lets you know that you're closing off this marquee. So if I get close to it, I see that icon, then I just click, and you can see now I have this selection. So now I have this layer selected, I have my selection that I want, and now what I can do is just delete, and now I have this little corner that I can use for something else. So I'm going to deselect, and I'm going to bring this over here, and then what I can then do, I have a bunch of different options. I can bring this over on this side, I can bring this up top here, maybe transform, rotate that around, whatever you want to do, but now I have options that I can use for this graphic. Maybe that's not a particularly nice looking layout, depending on what you want to do, but you can then utilize this graphic however you want. You can also mask it off and do a few other things, but the point is that you have this tool that allows you to click, 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 and then you can close that off depending on what you want to use. So these are just options. You're going to find that as you're designing something, you're going to be using a lot of these different tools in a lot of different situations. Sometimes you're going to be using all of them for a lot of different ways. So let's take a look at this graphic over here, and I'm going to go to my Move tool. Say I like this little squiggly kind of graphic over here, kind of just using a brush tool and just making a little squiggle. And say I maybe want to put it as sort of a background to this graphic here. A lot of times what you want to do is put this in your layout and then put something on top of it, say this 25% off. However, when you move this around, you realize, wait a second, there's a white box around my graphic. So if I go to this layer and I hide it, you can see that it's on one layer. And this pops up a lot within design. You'll be given or you'll get something on the internet and it'll just be flattened. It won't have a transparent background. So you're gonna have to use our tools here in Photoshop in order to take this background out and clip it out so you have this graphic where it doesn't have a white box around it. So in this case, what we can then do is go to our wand or our magic wand. So what you can then do is, again, you have some options up here which you can use. And if I click using the magic wand, what you can see is it's going to select whatever color that you have, and this will get a little tricky. This is very simplistic. It'll get a little tricky when you're using a photograph and you have lots of different variations of color, but these are very flat colors, and this is a good way of explaining this tool. If you're going to be selecting a background, make sure it has a solid background. And so what I mean by that, if I zoom in a little bit, you can see how this is a very clean edge. And when I mean clean, it doesn't have lots of gradients, it doesn't have lots of variation in terms of its color. It's just white and black. So if I select this, then what I can then do is I have a few different options here. So in this situation, you can just simply delete. Press your delete key and it'll cut out away from this object. However, if I deselect by pressing Command D, you see this white edge that goes around your object. And you even have some little spots in here that are have a little bit of white. And this isn't a very professional look. That doesn't look very good. So even if you're going to be using it as a background, and let me pull this underneath our little graphic here. So I'm just moving this down underneath the layout, this layout folder. And actually what I want to do is I want to open this folder and then pull this in and put it underneath our elliptical here. And I can slide this around. But even still, even if it's going to be in the background, you still really don't want to have that look. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo. I'm going to press Command Z a few times to get us back to our original selection here. So what are another option that you can use to make sure you don't have any of those white little spots? Well, in some cases, you're going to may have to do some manual work. But let's try to use the program as much as we can in order to remove that white background, those little white marks. Well, the first thing what we can do is we can go to our select, we can go to modify, and we can go to expand. Now, the reason why we want to go to expand is we have this white background selected, and you can see that by this marquee tool that goes around, and it's selected on this, around this little shape here, around our little squiggly shape. Now, we can reverse this selection. If we go to Shift Command I, we can also, Command I, and that will reverse this selection. So if you go up to, say, inverse, Shift Command I, you can see that now that is going to be reversed. But what we're going to do is we're going to keep this selection and we're just going to expand. So I'm going to go to Select, Modify, and then Expand. And we're going to go to Expand by 1 pixel. So I'm going to press OK. And now I'm going to delete. And you can see that we cleaned up our selection pretty good. We still have some white marks here, and we can then use a manual process to get rid of some of those extra marks. So let me show you another way where we can kind of clean this up a little bit more, even more. So if I double click on this layer and then I go to, say, color overlay, you can see that we now have this selected, but it cleans up all our white marks. So if I go to the blue and our color overlay on our blend, we can go back to our black. Now you can see that it completely clears up anything that we might have down there. Now if I move this into position and put this underneath, and then what we can then do is just work on composition and making sure that we have it in a spot that we like. If we need to transform this, right now it is a rasterized image, but we can still move this around and get it into a position that we like. And we could always change the background of this if we need to. So what I'm going to do is go to color overlay and maybe make this a darker gray, something like that, so that pops out a little bit more. So there is one other thing that I want to show you with the selection tool, or the magic wand, excuse me. Now we have a tolerance that we can adjust as well. Now this is going to be good if you zoom in here and I want to go to this graphic and I'll go back to my magic wand, and you can see we have a tolerance at 32. If I select, you can see that we have a good edge around it, but just as before, it's not very close. So what we can then do is we can go up to this tolerance, and you'll notice this is something that you can notice with a lot of different options within Adobe Photoshop, is that you'll see these two arrows. You'll have your hand symbol icon, and you'll have these two arrows. That means that you can then move this kind of like a slider and increase the value of this number. So you can move it left or right depending on how much you want to adjust this tolerance. Or you can just simply select this and then type in a value. So we're going to bring this up a little bit and then make this selection again. And you can see that it's getting tighter and tighter as we adjust this tolerance. Now, you can also go in the reverse way. Say you want a little bit more tolerance, and that will get that even closer. And then that will give us even a tighter mark around our object. So I think I said that wrong in the beginning. So as you bring up your tolerance, you get, depending on where you select, you can get this pretty loose, and then if you bring this even tighter, you can get a tighter amount, a closer amount with the marquee tool. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about layers. So on the right-hand side, you can see that we have our layers palette, and this is something that we're going to be using pretty much all the time when doing any type of design work. Now, I have this basic graphic design here in the center of our composition, and you can see that we have our background layer, and then we have a folder, and we have a little icon here that lets you know that you can open up this folder, and we have a few items within this in this design that we can then adjust, manipulate, and do whatever we need to do. Now you'll see that we have a few options up here, and I'll go through each of these and explain these, but basically this is what you want to know when using using layers, is that in order to make a new layer, we'll come down here to this icon right down here at the bottom of our layer palette. Click on this icon. It's the one right between the trash can icon, and you can see a little folder icon, so it's right in between, and it's going to open up a new layer. Now, since I am in this folder, it's going to create this new layer within that folder. So I'm just going to pull this out. And it's just a basic empty layer. There's nothing in it, and it allows us to create on that layer. So for example, what I mean by that is if I go to, say, the brush tool, and I have this color selected, and let me add in a little bit, make this brush a little bit larger. And then if I just click and paint, now I have something within this layer. I can move it around. I can use our selection tools to modify it in some way. But this is the basics of what we would need in order to create something on a layer. Now, this could be something like, say, you copy and paste it into this layer, but this is basically how you would either create something, or you would have a layer that you would bring in, such as a photo, a logo, a graphic that you would bring into Photoshop. So if we want to delete this layer, what we can then do is just come down to this trash can, press click on that, and it'll delete that layer. Now you can see that I have a folder. Now if I add in a new layer, bring this out of the folder, what I can then do is create a folder, and this allows us to organize our layer palette a little bit better. So once that's created, then you can add something into the folder. So if I pull this in here, I go back to my brush tool, and I paint in here. Now I can move this folder around. I have auto select deselected. Now I can just move this around and whatever else I have within that folder. So if I change my color to say maybe this orange here, and I come up to my brush tool and maybe I use a bit of a smaller pen here. So now anytime I move this folder, oops, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I want to put this on a new layer. So sorry about that. And then what I can then do is draw within that layer. And now I can move this, all of this items, no matter how many you have within that folder. And then you can still maneuver around and move these objects around because they're on separate layers. Now we have a few different options down here, and I'm going to talk about masking and adjustment layers. So there's going to be situations where, say, maybe you want to adjust something within this layer. You want to manipulate this layer in some way. So that's what these adjustment layers, filters are going to be used for. What you can then do is go to, say, solid color, and you can just paint within that layer. I'm going to undo. And then what you can then do is maybe you want to put in a gradient. You could do that, or you can undo, bring that out. So there's all these different types of things that you can add to it or adjust that particular layer. So in this case, maybe bring the contrast down or brightness down, increase the contrast. So just keep in mind, anytime you add in an adjustment layer, what that's going to do is that's going to affect everything that's underneath that layer. So if I double click on this, bring this brightness down, you can see it changes everything in this layer and everything below it. So keep that in mind. So if you want to, say, maybe just have this this graphic changed, you could just pull that underneath that layer. So keep that in mind. I'm just going to press Command Z just to get back. And so that's what these adjustment layers are. They're all kinds of different kinds. You have pattern, brightness, levels. What that will do is that will allow you to, it's sort of like a contrast. You can punch up the darks, and using this layout here, you can adjust these handles that will allow you to adjust either the darks or the shadows, or adjust the brightness. And you have all kinds of different kinds. Hue saturation, color balance, photo filter, color lookup. You can invert. You can do all these different types of adjustment layers to adjust what's going on within your layers. Okay, so I want to talk about masking in this lesson. So there's going to be situations where you want to mask off a graphic or a photo. You can see here in this layer, in this folder, you can see I have a mask. So what I want to do is I want to right click on this icon, right click, and then go to Disable Layer Mask. Now you can see that I just have a rectangle selection and a rectangle mask, I should say, that cuts off the ends of these layers. And these are just some rectangle layers that I threw in, and then just used the transform tool to rotate that around, and then applied this mask. So I can go back to enable mask in order to give me a pretty uniform and interesting look with these layers. So next, what I want to show you is how to actually create this mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this layer mask so we can just start over fresh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my marquee, my rectangle marquee tool, and I want to make a selection. And as I told you before, you can hold down your space bar and get it into a position where you're not going over the corners. So right down, right into the center here. And then you can always move this selection around too, just as long as you're within that marquee, kind of move it around. So I'm on the folder, not the layer, but on the folder of the layers. And now I can press this icon here, click on this icon, and it will add a layer mask to the folder. So everything that's within this folder is now being masked off. So depending on how many graphics that you have in here, and you want to cut that off, it will mask that off. So that's how you add in masks. Now, you keep in mind, you can do that for any type of selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a new layer, and I want to add in just go to a selection here, and I'm going to fill in this layer, this selection with this color. So what I can then do is, using all of the tools that I have here, if I want to use, say, the Lasso tool, and I just want to do a little selection here, and then go to my layer, and then come down here where it says add mask, add layer mask, you can see that whatever's in that selection will now be masked off. So what I can also do is, if I can undo, and what I can do is, after I made that selection, I can go to select, and then I can go to inverse, and then add in a mask. Now it's going to take away, it's going to mask that off. Now keep in mind that you have this icon pops up when you add in the layer mask. You can see that we have this little keychain that is, or I shouldn't say keychain, but a chain link, and that means that these two parts are connected. The image itself, whatever graphic that you're masking, and then the mask. So if I click on that little link, now these are unlinked. So what I then can do is go to my move tool with this icon, this part selected, this little preview. Make sure you're not on the mask itself, but the graphic that you're masking. Now you can move this graphic, this image, and have it masked off. Now you can do the same, you can do the same thing with the folder. So if I go to my image as my folder, and then I move that around, you can see I can move these graphics, these layers within this mask. And then what I can then do is link that back up again. What I kind of like doing, and this is just my own workflow, you'll kind of find your own, but I like to use a folder with a mask as opposed to masking just this particular image. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with putting a mask on the layer that you want to mask. But there's lots of situations where I just want to have this mask, and now I can just simply move my graphics around and make adjustments knowing that this mask is still there. I don't really have to click any link in order to move something within that mask. I'm just masking just the folder, and then I can move things around within that in order to mask that off. So that's just my own process, but you can certainly use a layer mask on the folder or the layer. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the type tool and its effects. So in order to bring up the type tool, we'll go to T on our keyboard, or we can click on this icon right down here. And there's a couple ways you can add in. You can simply just click and then type the text that you want to type in. So I'm going to type in bacon, and then you can just press enter on your keyboard, and that will enable that text. And then you can move this text anywhere you want. So I'm going to undo. And now I'm going to show you the other way, which is to click, hold, and drag. And it brings up sort of like a marquee. And then what you then can do is type in the text that you want to type in. And say, let's say bacon, tuna, soda, and chips. So once you have that in, and you can see that now we have this box that we can then adjust if we need to. Now you can see that once we have our text that we want in place, we can select all our text by just clicking and dragging. And then we can make adjustments to our font and a few other very simple, very basic options that we have here in our attributes here. And we can adjust this by using this slider. We can type in the text that we specifically want, or we can highlight this text and then use the up and down arrows to add in increments to the size of our font, to the size of our text. Now you can see that now it's kind of blending together as we increase the size, but we still need to adjust the leading. In order to do that, would go over to this palette here. So anytime you don't see your options that you want to adjust in this attributes panel at the top, you can come down to the text panel and they'll be found in here. So once we have, say, a size that we want, say 30, whatever, and then we can adjust our leading here. And it's the same situation. We can use the slider. We can adjust the value by typing it in or selecting it and just using the up and down arrows to adjust. And so say we want to adjust its justification. Right now it's left justification. We would go to the paragraph tab, and that's, you can either click that here or click that right at the top here. Now also we have our justification up here as well, so you can go to center, right, and we can adjust that. Say center would be fine. Now we can also just adjust the color as well up here and in the text area here as well. So let's say we like everything, we like where it is. You can just simply press enter, and then that will enable that text. And then of course you can always adjust that. Now if you want to make edits to this text, what you can do is double click on the text, or you can double click in the text here on your layer palette. Just double click within this icon, this T icon, and that will also enable you to edit that text. Okay, great. So, and at this point, you can adjust this manually using the move tool. Now, just keep in mind, if you're going to adjust anything, you want to keep it center, you can hold down shift, and then you can move that up and down, but not left to right. And then you can also use the transform, Command T, and then resize that if you want. Okay, So at this point, you can make adjustments to text that you already have. So if you have some text that you want to give it some effects to, what you can then do is double click on the layer. And this will give you bring up some layer styles that you can then adjust. Say for an example, you can add in a drop shadow, and just want to make sure I'm centered here. You can bring up a drop shadow, and keep in mind you can adjust the distance. You can adjust the size. If you want it tighter, you can adjust the spread. You can also adjust the opacity as well. Bring that really dark. So you have some options here if you want to do something with your text that'll give it a better effect, a better look. You can adjust the gradient, and you can't really see that one too well. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to make sure we're on our gradient. We're going to select that, and we're going to adjust this. But what I want to make sure though is if you're doing a gradient overlay, you want to take a look at the style. Right now it's set to radial, and you can see that with this little preview here. So you can adjust that or change that to maybe linear, and you can go to maybe a brighter font, brighter color, and maybe a darker one. We can leave that. That's fine. But maybe you don't want it left to right. You can adjust this angle. You can hold down Shift, and that'll give you a 90-degree angle. You can reverse it, and you can also adjust its opacity. And you can even play with its blend mode if you like. Okay, so what else? We can also adjust the scale of it. That won't affect it too much. And we can bring this up a little bit. Now you can also go with the radial. You can adjust this as any type that you want, any type of style, which is totally fine. So a few others, you might want to adjust the stroke at some point. After a while, you want to use your own creative judgment of how many styles that you want to add on to something. Generally, you don't, this is kind of getting into aesthetics and not so much the specifics to the software, but you generally don't want to over design your text. The point is you want to be able to read it and quickly read what you're trying to convey and what you're trying to communicate. But you can also adjust the stroke. And now when you start doing a lot of these effects, a little bit goes a long way. So I would suggest kind of using sort of a kind of a lighter touch if you're going to be adding anything in. Now, keep in mind, when you're adding in a stroke, you want to know where the position is. Right now, the position is on the inside. You might do better with, like, say, a thin text. You might want to go for the outside, and we can adjust the opacity a little bit. So you can see, I noticed that if you're going to be doing any type of styles, that's probably best for something like a header, something that you want to really have stand out away from the background. That's when you're really going to be adding in some of these text effects, especially if you're doing some type of logo, you want to do something like that. You can use that as well. And keep in mind, you can use these layer effects to any layer. It doesn't have to be the type tool. And so once you have something in place that you like, you can still make adjustments to it in terms of, like, you can still edit the text, and that will be completely fine. Adding in these effects won't keep you from adding in any edits. In this lesson, we're going to go over the brush tool and the pen tool. Okay, so we have this one image that we were taking a look at, and we're going to just use this as a reference. This isn't really going to be a drawing lecture or a lesson, but it's really just kind of getting you to understand the tools. So don't worry about making exactly what I'm going to be making. So what we want to do is we want to use this as a reference, and what we can then do is maybe drag the opacity down so maybe it's not so harsh. And what we want to do is we want to lock this image down. So we can choose this lock icon, and that's going to lock that down. So anything that I do, anything I try to move to it, it's going to give me a dialog box and say, don't do that. So I'm going to go to a new layer, and this will be our working layer where we'll be able to add in any type of marks or strokes. So I'm just going to put in, type in working for our layer. And so we're going to go to our brush. We're going to go to this brush tool, and we can go to B on our keyboard. And what we can then do is go to our brush palette here, and we can kind of take a look at some of the brush sizes. But what I like to do is I like to go to brush settings, and this gives us a lot more things that we can kind of play around with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at our screen, and I just want to see the stroke that I'm going to be making on our for our reference, using our reference as a guide. So I'm just going to be just kind of sketching this eye out a little bit, and you can see the size of the brush. Now we can adjust this size of the brush by using this slider here. We can bring this up. And I'm just going to add in a few marks here. Just kind of sketch it out. Now what we can then do, and I'm just going to maybe go around this a little bit more. What we can then do, we can adjust a lot of the different settings that we have here. So we have our hardness, and this is going to give us a more sharper edge instead of a feathered edge. And we can increase the spacing. So as we draw, we get this sort of dot pattern. So there's a little bit more of a space in between those. And, adjusting that is really based on your preference or what you're trying to accomplish. If you want to do something like that, you can do some type of graphical design. Say you want to not make it very realistic. You want to give it a more of a graphic design feel instead of a drawing painterly feel. So I'm going to undo back a little bit. So let me bring this down back to somewhere where it was. And so we have a few different brushes that we can use. So if we click on here and we go to, say, its settings, we can maybe check out some of the default presets. We can make new brushes. So we have options here in what we want to do. And I just did a restore to our brush settings. Let's bring it back to its default. I use other programs for drawing. I use Sketchbook Pro. That's made by Autodesk. But Photoshop has some really excellent drawing tools in here. And you can see that we can kind of bring down maybe a more softer feel. We can try this soft round pressure size. And you can see as we kind of, play around with this a little bit. Now I'm using a Wacom tablet, but you can totally use your mouse as well. That's not a problem. So let's take a look at what else we have. We also have various, say this one's a pencil. So there's different types that you can use depending on, what you're trying to accomplish. So it's kind of give us more of a pencil, maybe a graphite feel. If you have any experience with doing any type of traditional art, this will kind of mimic that. And then maybe we want to add in this crease in the fold of the skin around the eye. So you can kind of adjust that. And you can always take off or hide, the layer. So if you want to take a look at the drawing without its reference and see how it's turning out. So that is the brush tool, and there's, obviously you can really go deep into all the different brushes. You can use them all. You can use just a selection of like one or two. Some of these are actually really pretty interesting. And then maybe let's use this wet blender and maybe pick up a color here. And maybe we want to use a different layer for this one. So I'm going to click on this layer, make a new layer, and see if we can kind of get a color here. This might be not the right tool for this. Yeah, see, this is more of a blending tool. So let's see if we can pick something else out. Something like this. Bring our reference back, and we kind of adjust this as we go. And maybe we want to bring this underneath our, you can almost look at it as this is our ink and our black ink, drawing, and now we want to kind of bring in some color underneath it. So, definitely experiment with some of these brushes. So in the next lesson, we'll talk about the pen tool. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the pen tool. So to go to the pen tool, we'll go to this icon right here. We can also press P on the keyboard. Now we have a new layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click anywhere in our document, and you can see the icon just letting us know that it's ready to add in a pen point. So if I just click, you can see we have this little point. And then as I continue to click, you can see how the points will then fill in with the color. Now, it's the same thing as that I showed you before with the lasso tool, is you can close off this point, this object, by just clicking on its origin point. Now keep in mind, you can also drop the fill for this, for the color that you have, and this will allow you to see what's underneath this layer, the layer underneath. Now, what you can also do is you can add in points by clicking anywhere within the in-between of the points that you already have created. Now you're going to see that these have extra points, and those are Bezier points, and I'll show you those in a second. Now you can go down to this icon, and if you click on hold, you can see that we have a few different other options that we can choose. We have delete anchor point, so we can delete any of the ones that we created. Let me click on this again, and you can see another one. We have add anchor point, and you can see the difference. You have the plus sign and the minus sign on this icon. So we can go to add in an anchor point. Now, if I want to adjust this polygon, this amount of paths that we created, we can go down here to, we have path selection and direct path selection. So if I use the direct path selection, I can choose a point at any point that I created, and I can select it and then move it. Now, if I go to the path selection, what that will allow me to do, that will allow me to move the entire path and all its points. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to start over with a new layer. And we'll go back to our pen tool. We'll go to our original pen tool. And what we can then do is click, drag, click, hold, and drag. And that will bring us these Bezier points, these little anchor points. And I can continue clicking, holding, and dragging to create a curve path. And I'm just following the outline of this eye. And while I'm clicking, I can still go to the fill and drop the fill down. And that'll give me sort of an opacity, if I would like. But I'm going to bring this all the way down to 0 for now. And now I can continue clicking and going through. Now, I want to point out something as you're using this pen tool. But real quick, let me undo for a second. And as I close this point, you can see how the icon changes. Same with the lasso tool. So I can click on it and then drag and then still adjust while holding down my mouse button. I can still adjust the length and the shape where I'm turning this at. So just keep that in mind. So what I was about to say is, what you can do is when you're adding in points, the more points that you add in, the more the rougher the path becomes. And the less, the more smoother the path becomes. So you can see I have a bunch of points up here, and if I bring up my fill and then I choose another layer to get rid of those points, not get rid of, but remove the visibility of those points, you can see the smoothness of this outline. Whereas here it's a little bit bumpy. It's a little bit, it's a little bumpy up on this top side a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that again. I'm going to make a new layer and I have my pen tool selected. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to start up here somewhere not quite at the top of this little ellipse. You can kind of look at this as an ellipse, not quite at the top. And I want to bring this over, click, hold, and drag, and I'm going to bring this fill down just so it's not distracting. And I'm going to click and drag again, and then click again and drag. And you're going to need to add in more points when you get to more of like or closer points when you want to have a nice tight turn like this. Click again, and then I'll click one more time here and then here. Okay, so now that I have those set, what I can then do is go to my direct selection tool and then start making adjustments to get the shape that I would like. So maybe I want to pull this anchor point a little bit closer over here so I can get this nice turn. And maybe I want to adjust these points just a bit. Maybe spread them out. And you can always, if you accidentally miss it, what you can then do is click on the path to bring up that path again. But you can also go to your paths palette and you can see where you have this shape. So suppose I click off. If I click back on this again, you can see it brings it back. It brings back that path. So if you accidentally click off and you don't see it, it disappears because it's not an actual shape just yet. What you can then do is come back to your path palette and then select that layer, that path. I shouldn't say layer, but path. So what I can then do is come back and click on its individual points again. So here's a little rough area, so maybe I want to change the shape of this a bit. And you don't have to be perfect right now. I'm just kind of showing you exactly how to use this tool. So don't be afraid if you're not getting it exactly the way that you want. I just want you to see how these paths and these anchor points and what they do when you move them. And if you turn them, you can kind of get a really kind of like a twisted shape, depending on what object and kind of shape that you're making. Okay, so there are some other options here. If you go to this convert point tool, this is also very useful because say you're making a curve, you're making a an object, you have this nice curved Bezier anchor points, but say you want to have a nice sharp edge. What you can then do is use this tool on a point and just click, and it's going to remove those handles. And you can do the same here. So now you have a nice flat shape going across with these nice curve shapes. So you can do that as well. So I'm going to undo. And now we have these nice paths that you can always go back to and change. Now, I had this down to fill, so I could bring this back down, bring this back up to 100%. And now I can fill this shape with anything that I want. I can fill it with a white. I can bring in a gradient. If I double click, I can go to a gradient overlay. So I have a bunch of different options that I can choose after I make the shape that I want. So just keep that in mind that this is available to you in any way that you want to do it. So if I bring back some of the painterly effects that I used, you can see now I have this nice shape. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the smart objects. Okay, you're going to see two images in this document, and they look completely identical. However, if we go to our layers palette, you can see that one, we have a different icon for its preview. Now, this one, the lander, the one I have labeled lander, is a rasterized image, and the one below it, the image right next to it, is the same image but in a smart object. Now, when you resize something in Photoshop, if I select it with my auto select on, and I transform this, Command T to bring up your transform, you're going to notice that we have a height of 100% and width at 100%. So when I scale this image down, something to this amount here, and then we'll go to our other layer, the smart object, and we'll do the same thing, transform. You're going to see that we have 100%. and we transform this down to about the same size. Now, however, if we go to our other object, the lander without the smart object, and we go to transform, you can see it stays at 100%. It doesn't retain the information that it originally had in the opening of this video. So if I transform this back again to its original size, and then we transform our smart object, Command T for transform, we'll transform this, but you'll notice that at the width and the height, it stays 45% of its original document, of its original size, excuse me. So I'm going to resize this and bring it to 100%. And I could do that by just typing 100%. And then we'll just hit return on our keyboard. And now we have our two images. The difference is that if you look at this image, it doesn't retain the same quality. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and you can see how it has lost a lot of its quality. It lost its pixel information because I resized it back and forth. But with a smart object, it will retain that pixel information, and you'll keep that sharp quality of the image. So this is very useful when you're bringing in a photo and you have to manipulate it. You have to move it around and resize it. But a lot of times it's not exact. You may have to resize it up and back again in order to get it into the layout that you want. So it's very useful to have a photo brought in as a smart object. So what I want to show you next is the way that you would make a smart object that is already just a raster image. And so what I'll do is I'll create a new layer, and I'll go to my rectangle marquee tool, and I'm going to hold down shift and just make a square. And I'll choose a different color, something like orange or something. And then I'll fill this with my Option Delete key, keyboard command, and that will fill this rectangle, this square, with the foreground color. So what you can then do is right click on your layer and come down here where it says Convert to Smart Object. So now you can see that this icon has changed to the smart object, similar to the other one that I had. So now I can transform this image, this square, and not worry about losing any of its quality. Now, I do want to just warn you about this. You can't, if you resize it any further than 100%, then it won't keep the same pixel information. Adobe Photoshop is going to have to put in that pixel information, and you'll lose a little bit of quality. So keep that in mind when using any type of smart object. So your original size has to stay the same, or it can't go any further than that, any larger than that, or you will lose quality to that image. Okay, great. So we're now able to keep this at a good size, and I'm just going to put in 100% and then return. And now if I zoom into this edge, you can see it keeps this nice crisp edge. Otherwise, if I just had a rectangle and I just filled this and went to a new layer, Option Delete, make sure I'm on a new layer. And without a smart object, and I resize this, and then bring this back up again, you can see if I zoom in a little bit, you can see the quality of the edge loses its sharpness compared to our other object, which is perfect. And here we lose that pixel information. So I just want to explain that a little bit better. As you resize an image that does not have a smart object, you will lose quality. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about saving files within Photoshop. So say you wanted to save this design or whatever design you're working on. First, obviously, you would want to save it as a Photoshop document. So you would go to File and Save. And if you were going to save it as another document, you would go to Save As. So if you were going to save a document you would have to know the specific purpose that you're trying to save it out as. So if you have a few different options, now the main ones that you're going to be working with are going to be TIFF, which is for print, PNG, which generally has the capabilities of having a transparent background, which is also very important, and then of course a JPEG right here. So JPEG is the universal graphic image that you would save for web, for social media, whatever project you're trying to save it at. Most platforms and sites will accept JPEG. So that's sort of the universal graphical file format. Now TIFF holds layers, but generally it's for the print industry. So if you're going to, and what I mean when I say print, what I mean is, if you were just going to print a document, you would just go to File and Print, and whatever printer that you have associated either with the computer or your network. But when I say save for print, something that you're going to be putting in, say a brochure, a catalog, something like that, where you're going to be sending it to a printer and having it commercially duplicated for print, you would definitely want to use a TIFF document or TIFF file format. Now we do have GIFs. GIFs are an image format that you can use. Now it's generally, if you're going to use a raster or a vector graphic, those are the two choices when you're saving out an image. If you're going to be using a rasterized image, which is this graphic here, that would definitely be for a JPEG. You would save that as a JPEG. If you had something like a vector image, a vector graphic, say a logo, you would want to save that as a GIF. The reason being is that for JPEGs, you would have all this gradient information. Oops, excuse me. If I zoom in, you can see all this different pixel detail. That is perfectly for JPEG. That's the perfect file format. For GIF, that's going to be more solid colors, and that's generally going to be your vector graphics such as logos and icons and that kind of thing. Now a GIF does have the ability to have a transparency. So you can see I have this white background, but if I take this off and I save this, what I can do is I can save that as a GIF, and that could be for a transparent background if you're going to be putting it on a website. So if I'm going to save for web, I would go to Save for Web. So that's going to be File. Oops, let me cancel out of this for a second. File and then Save for Web. Now you can get to that in a few different ways. You can go to File and then you could go to Export and you have Save for Web. Now when I go to this graphic, this dialog box, you can see, if I kind of pull this out a little bit so you can see the full image, you have your preset and then you have the format that you want to save it out at. You can save it as a GIF, and you can see this transparency show up. And you also have the ability to save it as a JPEG and a PNG. Now you also have File save as, or excuse me, export, and you can go to export as, and it gives you a similar dialog box, and you can choose the JPEG, GIF, or SVG. And that's generally going to be if you're going to have a logo and you want to be able to put it on the web. That's definitely something you would use for SVG. I put a link in the description to download project files from this course as well as all the courses that I've made so far at astronomicskills.com. I also set up a Patreon page. If you like these courses, please check out my Patreon page. I added a bunch of benefits such as reference images, base meshes, PDF guides, access to podcasts, and behind-the-scenes videos. Also for students, there are projects, homework, critique, and feedback videos. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again tomorrow for another course.